Intro. He was a man who had everything until grief took it all away. And she was the woman who had nothing left except her quiet compassion. When fate brought them together, no one expected what would be built from the ruins of their broken souls. This is not a love story in the way you might think. It is not about flowers, promises, or grand gestures. It is about silence, pain, and the fragile threads that connect two people when the world has already taken too much from them. Emily Hart, 26 years old, works as a nurse. To the outside world, she is calm, steady, and kind. Patients trust her smile, her gentle touch, her reassuring words. But beneath that calm surface lies a scar she never speaks of, the sudden loss of her younger brother years ago. She carries that weight quietly, like a shadow she cannot shake. Daniel Hayes is 34, once a rising entrepreneur, full of ambition and energy. He now walks through life as if in slow motion. His wife's tragic death shattered him, leaving him with a successful business but an empty heart. He hides behind silence, isolating himself from friends, colleagues, and even from life itself. Two broken souls, two parallel lives. They should have never crossed paths. And yet, they do, inside the sterile, white halls of a hospital. Emily notices him first, not because of his appearance, but because of the silence that surrounds him like a heavy fog. Daniel notices her too, though he pretends not to. Something about her presence unsettles the darkness he clings to. Their meeting is ordinary, but the story that unfolds is anything but. From grief to healing, from silence to unspoken understanding. Their journey reminds us that even in the quietest corners of our lives, hope can be reborn. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where the untold truths of the heart come alive. One story at a time. 1. The first meeting. The first time Emily saw him, it wasn't because of his appearance. In a hospital, people come and go every day, faces blur. Names are forgotten, but certain presences remain. Daniel's presence was one of them. He walked slowly through the sterile white corridor, shoulders heavy as if the air itself pressed down on him. His eyes avoided everyone else's, fixed on the ground like he was afraid to look up and meet another soul. Emily, carrying a tray of charts, caught a glimpse of him. Something about his silence struck her. Nurses are trained to recognize symptoms, fever, pain, weakness, but what Emily recognized in him wasn't physical. It was the kind of weight you carry when the world has already taken something from you and never gave it back. Daniel checked in quietly, almost mechanically, with the receptionist. No small talk, no casual smile. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. But not with ease, more like a ritual he endured, not a routine he embraced. When Emily approached to take his vitals, she noticed how his hands trembled slightly when he rolled up his sleeve. He wasn't nervous about the needle or the blood pressure cuff, no. This was a different kind of trembling, the kind that comes from holding yourself together for too long. Their eyes met briefly. Daniel tried to look away, but not before Emily saw it, the emptiness behind them, the kind that only comes from loss. For a second, she wanted to ask, "Are you okay?" But she knew better. Some wounds don't need questions, they need presence. Instead, she smiled, gentle but not forced, and carried on with her work. Daniel gave a polite nod. Nothing more, but in that fleeting exchange, something passed between them. Not words, not promises, just recognition. Two broken souls, seeing each other without saying a thing. 2. Silent observations. Emily began to notice the pattern. Daniel always came at the same time, walking the same corridor, keeping the same posture, as if routine was the only thing holding him together. He rarely spoke more than a few words. His voice, when he used it, was low and tired, like a man who had long stopped expecting comfort in return. She observed quietly. He would sit in the waiting room, hands folded tightly, gaze lost somewhere beyond the walls. People around him flipped through magazines, checked their phones, whispered to loved ones, but Daniel sat in silence, untethered, as if the world no longer had anything to say to him. What struck Emily most was his restraint. Even when something seemed to bother him, an extended wait, a misplaced form, he never complained. He simply endured. That endurance spoke louder than words. It wasn't patience. It was a survival tactic. The habit of someone who had already lost the fight they most wanted to win. From behind her desk or in passing, Emily allowed herself small glimpses. She noticed the way he straightened his back, forcing composure that didn't reach his eyes. She noticed the tremor in his hands when he signed documents, the pause before he answered a question, the hesitation before meeting anyone's gaze. She didn't pry. Nurses are taught boundaries, and Emily respected them, but in the quiet of her own heart, she felt an ache, recognition. Because she, too, had mastered that silence once. She knew what it meant to sit in a crowded room and still feel utterly alone. And so, she watched him, not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but out of something deeper. The silent knowledge that pain recognizes pain. And sometimes, the first step toward healing begins not with words, but with someone quietly noticing that you exist. 3. The triggering moment. It happened on a quiet evening. The kind where the hospital hummed with low voices and the shuffle of tired footsteps. Daniel was in the corridor, waiting for his results, when suddenly a code was called. Nurses rushed, doctors sprinted, and a family in the waiting room clung to each other with desperate prayers. Within minutes, the flat, final sound of the monitor filled the air. A life had slipped away. For most people, it was a distant tragedy, sad, but removed. For Daniel, it was as if the walls around him cracked open and pulled him back into the night he lost his wife. The beeping, the hurried footsteps, the helplessness, it was all the same. His breath quickened, his vision blurred, and his hands trembled as though he were reliving it. Moment by moment, Emily noticed him sitting apart, his posture rigid, his face pale. The room carried the weight of grief. But Daniel's grief was heavier, personal, unbearable. He clasped his hands so tightly his knuckles turned white, fighting to keep himself from collapsing into the memory that haunted him. When Emily approached, she didn't speak at first. She simply stood nearby, her presence a quiet anchor. Slowly, she knelt beside him, lowering her voice just enough to reach him without breaking the fragile silence. "You're safe," she whispered. It wasn't a question, not even a comfort, just a reminder that he wasn't back in that night. Not yet. Daniel's eyes glistened, unfocused, but her words tethered him. For the first time, he allowed himself to be seen in his weakness, the mask of control slipping. He didn't tell her what he saw, or what he heard, or what he lost. He didn't need to. The trembling in his body spoke louder than language. In that moment, Emily understood. This was not just a man visiting for checkups. This was someone carrying an unhealed wound that life kept pressing against. And whether he wanted it or not, that wound had just been torn open again. 4. The first conversation. For days, Emily had watched Daniel pass through the halls like a shadow. He carried himself with quiet control, as if every word cost him more than he could afford. But that night, after the patient's death rattled the silence, Daniel was different. He stayed longer than usual, sitting in an empty corner of the waiting area, his shoulders curved inward, his eyes fixed on nothing. Emily hesitated before walking over. Nurses are trained to care, but they are also trained not to intrude. Still, something in her told her this was not about medicine, not about charts or vitals. This was about a man breaking quietly in plain sight. She sat down a few seats away, close enough to be present, far enough to give him space. For a long while, there were no words, the hum of the vending machine, the distant echo of footsteps, The steady tick of the clock filled the void. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low, rough from disuse. "She didn't make it, did she?" His eyes never moved from the floor. Emily knew he wasn't talking about the patient anymore. She turned slightly toward him, her voice steady but soft. "No, and I'm sorry you had to see that." Silence lingered again, heavier this time. Then, with a sharp inhale, Daniel said it, the truth he had carried like a chain. "My wife. 3 years ago, same sound, same room, same helplessness, and I couldn't stop it then. Just like I couldn't stop it tonight." His words cracked on the last syllable. For the first time, the mask of control broke. Emily didn't rush to fill the silence. She let his confession breathe, let it echo in the space between them. When she finally spoke, it wasn't advice, wasn't pity. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. Her words were simple, but they landed with a weight Daniel wasn't prepared for. His jaw tightened, his hands trembled, but his eyes met hers for a fleeting second. In that fragile moment, Daniel realized something. This woman didn't see him as broken beyond repair. She simply saw him, and that was enough to keep him from disappearing into the silence again. 5. Emily's confession. Daniel's words lingered in the air long after he fell silent. He had finally spoken of his wife, of the night that shattered him. The weight of his grief pressed heavily between them. But Emily didn't flinch. She knew that silence after a confession wasn't emptiness, it was sacred. She sat still for a while, her hands folded on her lap, her gaze soft but unwavering. Then, almost unexpectedly, she let out a quiet breath. "You know," she began, her voice steady but threaded with something raw. "You're not the only one who carries a night like that." Daniel's eyes flicked toward her, cautious, uncertain. He had expected pity, maybe polite comfort. What he didn't expect was recognition. Emily's tone didn't change, but her words carried weight. "I lost my brother," she said. "He was only 18, car accident, one phone call, and my whole world shifted. I can still hear my mother's voice that night. I can still feel the silence that followed, like the world had just stopped breathing." Her eyes grew glassy, but she didn't look away. "People told me I was strong, that I handled it well. But they didn't see me when I couldn't get out of bed. When the guilt whispered that maybe I should have been there, maybe I could have done something. That kind of guilt, it doesn't leave easily." Daniel's posture shifted. For the first time, he saw the quiet steadiness in her, not as a nurse's composure, but as survival. She wasn't just someone who understood grief in theory. She had lived inside it. Emily didn't try to dress it up with hope. She simply placed the truth on the table between them, raw and unpolished. "So when I see you sitting here," she said softly, "I don't see someone broken beyond repair. I see someone still fighting the same fight I've fought. And I want you to know, you don't have to fight it in silence." Her words didn't erase Daniel's pain, but they carved out a small space where his grief no longer felt so isolating. For the first time in years, he wasn't the only one carrying a night that never ended. 6. The bond grows. In the days that followed, something subtle began to change. Their meetings were no longer limited to clipped exchanges in the hallway or silent glances across the waiting room. It was as if sharing their confessions had unlocked a fragile bridge between them, one they both hesitated to step on. But neither wanted to lose. Emily found herself looking forward to the moments when Daniel would appear. She no longer saw him as just another patient, but as someone she could sit with in quiet understanding. Sometimes, they didn't talk at all. They would sit outside the hospital with coffee cups warming their hands, letting the night air fill the space words couldn't reach. That silence was no longer heavy, it was shared. Daniel, for his part, noticed how her presence softened the edges of his grief. She never pressed him for details, never asked for more than he could give. Instead, she allowed him to exist exactly as he was, unpolished, incomplete, but real. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man defined only by what he had lost. There were small gestures that stitched their bond together. Emily slipping an extra sugar packet into his coffee because she noticed he liked it sweeter. Daniel offering her a seat when he saw exhaustion on her face after a long shift. These weren't grand acts, but they carried weight, the kind that whispered, "I see you." One evening, as they walked slowly past the hospital garden, Daniel spoke more freely than before. He told her about the little things he missed most, his wife's laugh, the way she used to leave notes in his briefcase. Emily listened without interruption, holding the space for his memories. When she responded, it was not with advice but with her own story, weaving her brother's memory into the fabric of their conversation. The bond grew not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet consistency. Two broken souls, carrying scars, choosing to walk a little closer together each day. And though neither called it love, both knew it was something just as rare, understanding that did not demand fixing, only sharing. 7. The setback. Just when their bond seemed steady, life reminded them how fragile healing could be. One afternoon, Daniel received a call from a lawyer handling his late wife's estate. A box of her belongings had been found, things he thought were already settled, already buried under paperwork and time. When he opened the box later that evening, the air shifted. Inside were her journals, her favorite scarf, a photograph of them at a beach years ago. The scent of her perfume, faint but still alive, clung to the fabric. It was as if she had walked back into the room. And with her return came the tidal wave of grief Daniel thought he had managed to contain. He didn't show up at the hospital the next day, or the day after. Emily noticed immediately, the empty seat in the waiting room, the missing shadow in the corridor. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She tried to tell herself that patients come and go, that Daniel owed her nothing. But the truth was simpler, she cared. On the third day, she found herself walking through the hospital garden, scanning for him. Nothing. That night, she sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone, debating whether to call the number he had once scribbled on a form. But boundaries held her back. Nurses don't chase patients. Still, her heart ached with the absence. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, the box still open on the table. He read and reread the notes his wife had left behind, her handwriting soft and familiar. Every line reminded him of what he lost, of what he failed to protect. The progress he had made with Emily felt distant, almost unreal. Grief has a way of convincing you that healing is betrayal. And in that moment, Daniel believed it. To let Emily in felt like letting his wife slip further away. So he pulled back, not because he didn't value Emily, but because he couldn't yet reconcile love, loss, and the possibility of moving forward. 8. The return. On the 5th day, just as Emily began to accept that Daniel might not return, she saw him again. He walked into the hospital late in the evening, his shoulders heavier, his face more drawn. The box of memories had hollowed him out, and the silence between his visits had left him even more fragile. Emily's heart tightened at the sight. She wanted to rush to him, but instead she remained steady, allowing him the dignity of his own steps. When he finally sat down in the waiting area, she approached slowly, not as a nurse this time, but as someone who refused to let his absence go unnoticed. "You disappeared," she said quietly. Her tone carried no anger, only concern. Daniel lowered his eyes. "I thought, maybe it would be easier if I pulled away. I thought I was betraying her by sitting here, talking to you." His voice cracked, carrying both guilt and exhaustion. Emily sat across from him, leaning forward slightly. "You're not betraying her by living," she said. "You're betraying yourself if you stop." Her words landed like a stone in water, rippling through the silence. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed ready to argue. But then his shoulders slumped, his resistance crumbling. "I found her things," he confessed, her scarf, her journals. It was like she was here again. And I couldn't bear it. It felt wrong to let anyone else near me when she was so present in that box. Emily's voice softened. Daniel, grief doesn't mean closing every door. It means carrying her with you while still finding space for yourself. For the first time since his withdrawal, Daniel looked at her fully. His eyes were weary, rimmed with red, but there was something else there too, a flicker of recognition that maybe he didn't have to face this alone. Emily didn't reach for his hand, didn't make any grand gestures. She simply sat, steady and present. Sometimes return doesn't happen with triumph, but with quiet surrender, and in that moment, Daniel had returned, not just to the hospital, but to the fragile thread that tied him to Emily. 9. A step toward healing. A week later, Emily suggested something unexpected. They were sitting on a bench near the hospital garden, the evening quiet settling around them, when she said softly, "Sometimes, the only way forward is to face the place we've been avoiding." Daniel frowned, uncertain. "And what if I'm not ready?" Emily looked down at her hands, then back at him. "You'll never feel ready. I didn't either. But when I finally went to the roadside where my brother's accident happened, it didn't erase the pain. It just gave it a place to belong. It wasn't swallowing me anymore." Her words lingered, and Daniel knew she was right. A few days later, they went together, first to the memorial for her brother, then to the cemetery where his wife rested. The drive was quiet, but it wasn't heavy. It was a silence filled with trust. At the memorial site, Emily placed a small wildflower at the plaque engraved with her brother's name. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I still miss you." Daniel stood beside her, not as a witness but as a companion. For the first time, her grief felt seen, not just carried alone. Later, at his wife's grave, Daniel hesitated, his breath shallow. He knelt slowly, his hand brushing against the cold stone. "I'm still here," he whispered, the words trembling. Emily stood behind him, giving him space, her presence steady. He stayed there for a long while, tears falling freely, not hidden this time. And when he finally stood, his shoulders felt lighter, not because the pain had gone, but because it was finally shared. As they walked back together, neither spoke of healing as a destination. Instead, they understood it as a step, a fragile, imperfect step, but it was enough. For the first time, Daniel realized healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant carrying love and loss side by side, and still choosing to walk forward. 10. The unspoken bond. After the visit to the memorials, something shifted between them. They didn't talk about it, didn't try to define it, but both could feel it, the invisible thread tying them together. It wasn't romance in the way people usually imagine. There were no dramatic confessions, no stolen kisses in the dark. Instead, it was quieter, deeper, and perhaps even stronger. In the days that followed, they built a rhythm, morning coffee shared in silence, occasional walks in the hospital garden, brief conversations about ordinary things, weather, books, the best place for soup near the corner cafe. On the surface, it looked unremarkable, but beneath, it was a language of presence. Each moment saying what words could not, "You are not alone." Daniel began to notice the small details about Emily. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. The way she laughed softly, almost apologetically, when she admitted she was tired. For him, these details anchored him back into the world, reminding him that life wasn't only about what had been lost, it was also about what still remained. Emily, in turn, noticed how Daniel slowly opened. He still carried the heaviness, but sometimes, when he forgot himself, a spark of warmth flickered in his expression. Once, she caught him watching a child in the waiting room, his eyes soft instead of hollow. It was fleeting, but it was real. They never said out loud what was happening between them. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. Their bond existed in the spaces between breaths. In the silence they both no longer feared. It was not love as the world defined it. It was something rarer. Two broken souls recognizing each other's scars and choosing to walk together without demanding healing on a schedule. And though no promises were spoken, both knew, deep down, that this unspoken bond was the beginning of something they could finally trust. Outro. Their story doesn't end with a miracle. Emily never erased Daniel's grief. And Daniel never filled the absence Emily carried. That was never the point. Healing, they both learned, is not about replacing what was lost. It's about carrying it differently, together. The bond they built wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention or require perfect words. It lived in silences, in quiet gestures, in the simple act of showing up. And sometimes, that is all a broken soul really needs. Someone willing to sit beside you in the dark until the dawn feels possible again. For Daniel, healing meant realizing that grief and love could coexist, that remembering his wife didn't mean shutting out everyone else. For Emily, it meant learning that sharing her brother's memory didn't weaken her, but connected her to someone who understood. And for us, their story is a reminder. We all carry wounds others cannot see. Some of us live with scars from the past, some with losses that still feel fresh. But we don't have to fight through them in silence. Connection, however fragile, however unspoken, can be the first step toward breathing again. So now, I want to ask you, what part of this story touched you the most? Was it Daniel's quiet struggle, Emily's confession, or the bond that grew between them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how their journey resonates with you. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us bring more untold stories to life. Share this video with someone who may need a reminder that healing is possible, even in silence. And most importantly, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast so you never miss the next story of love, loss, and the hidden truths of the human heart. Because here, every story matters, and maybe, just maybe, the story you need will find you.